Hi, I'm Vernā Myers, or as some of you fondly refer to me as, the Diversity Lady. Welcome to Sundays with Vernā podcast. I'm your host, Vernā Myers. Join me as I talk with the brightest minds in science and art and culture and politics to explore new perspectives, cultivate healing, and bridge divides across differences. I have fascinating conversations with people from all over the world, and I'm sharing these conversations here to inspire and to remind people how we are all connected. So catch new episodes every third Sunday of the month. And thanks for spending time with me today. If you enjoy my podcast, subscribe, rate, and review the show, and share it with your network. Now, let's jump right in. Today, I am so excited to tell you that we are going to have an incredible conversation with Dr. Jenn Jackson. And Dr. Jenn Jackson, we're going to talk specifically about your new book, Black Women Taught Us, an intimate history of Black feminism. And I'm first going to tell everybody a little bit about you, Doctor, and then we're going to get into the conversation. So Jenn M. Jackson is a queer, androgynous Black woman, an abolitionist, a lover of all Black people, and an assistant professor at Syracuse in the Department of Political Science. They are the author of the book, Black Women Taught Us, as I just mentioned, from Penguin Random House, and the book, Policing Blackness, both released this year. So you've been busy. And it's out of the University of Chicago Press. Both Jackson is a longtime columnist at Teen Vogue, penning articles on Blackness, intersectionality, racism, politics, and culture in the United States. They've also been published at Al Jazeera and Washington Post and Marie Claire and Ebony Magazine and The Root and many others that we don't have time today to get into. But academically, Dr. Jackson's research is in Black politics with a focus on racial threat and trauma, gender, and sexuality, Black politics and feminism, and social movements. Jackson received their doctoral degree in political science. Yay, I'm a political science major too, but not a doctor, at the University of Chicago in 2019. They're a native of Oakland, California, and will always represent their city.
Yes. Thank you for that lovely, I love the introduction. Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that.
Oh, it is my pleasure. First of all, I just want to say how much I loved this book. And I also added it to my newsletter for people to check out.
Thank you.
So there are some things we're not going to talk about right now because I want people to buy the book. Okay.
Yes.
So thank you so much for your work. And also, I just want to say, thank you for your honesty, your vulnerability, your courage, and your awesome storytelling. I mean, you have weaved together so many interconnecting threads and to create a rich history and a deep tapestry when viewed from a distance. And, it's interesting because you've left some cliffhangers as well. Yeah. So I'm assuming there may be another book, but I also wanted to say that, the stories are full of both sorrow and pain, and yet you brilliantly explore how these women manage to find joy and happiness in their circumstances. And I love you talking about trauma porn and learning that we don't actually have to represent ourselves only that way. And I think you did a great balance of that in the book. And of course, you touch on everything, on race, and gender identity, and sexuality, and class. I mean, you name it. And you leave many questions unanswered and open-ended. And I think that's really awesome for the reader because that's where we are, right? We have to stay open and grow and learn. Yeah. So
thank you for engaging with me. I love the engagement, by the way. It's so exciting as an author, someone to really engage deeply. So thank you for that.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I was in the car, I was doing all these things, but tell me how this came to be. But one thing I wanted to say before this is what reminded me of is Phyllis Wheatley.
Really?
Okay. People don't know about Phyllis Wheatley, but for whatever reason, in my little Black elementary school, there was this picture of Phyllis Wheatley. She's always looking the same, right? She has a little bonnet on her hair.
Yeah.
She's got that pin on her head.
Yep.
But she was like this amazing poet, even though she was enslaved.
Yeah.
And she was taught and educated by her slave owners. But at some point, pre-19th century, she became like this well-known poet.
Yes.
Through the nation and also in the UK. And for some reason, as a little girl, I was like, I can be Phyllis Wheatley.
Absolutely. I remember that. Yeah, absolutely. I remember that image so distinctly. It's like we all saw that image and we were all inspired to write because we saw little Phyllis Wheatley at this little desk and she's all matronly in her little apron. Yes, I remember that distinctly.
Yeah. And when you talk about these women and their lives, I was thinking, oh, Phyllis, what were you going through? Like, what was your interior life like? How did you deal with all that? Anyway, tell me about this book, how you came to write it.
Yes. So I love that question. This book came to be because it was it became an anthology of my own Black feminist journey. I opened up the book talking about this, thinking about how I came to Black feminism, and it was in a lot of ways by happenstance, right? I start off talking about my mother and my aunts, and I start off at a choir rehearsal in my own home, right? Because those were my earliest Black feminist teachers, right? The first people I learned Black feminism from were folks at church and folks in my community. And it was as I got further away from home, graduating from college, going into corporate America, that I was like untethered from those lessons, right? And I found myself in a state of desperation, looking for ways to connect because I was confronted with misogynoir at work, with all these kind of very overt attacks on my identities. And I called my mom on the phone one day and I was like, Mom, she's a voracious reader. I called her on the phone. I was like, Mom, all those books I used to read at home, who were they by? And the first person she said, she's like, Alice Walker, Terry McMillan, go to the bookstore, find them, and you'll find everything you need. And that is exactly what happened. Like I walked into a Borders bookstore and I saw Alice Walker, but I also saw Melissa Harris Perry's Sister Citizen. And when I saw this book, I was transfixed. I just knew whatever was in this book was for me, And I started reading about the Sapphire and the Jezebel and the Mammy, and I'm hearing about these stereotypes, and I'm crying into the book, at the store. And then I read about the crooked room and this theory that, for so many of us at the margins, especially Black women, we find ourselves where we feel as though we are walking sideways, like we're walking at a diagonal. Actually, that we are struggling to stand upright, and the world is crooked. The world is asking us to fit into these standards and these stereotypes that do not feel comfortable on our bodies. And when I saw that analogy, I was like, oh my God, it opened up everything, for me. And I decided in that moment, I was like, whatever this is, like whatever Melissa Harris Perry is doing, I need to be doing that, right? And I read everything. I read Audrey Lord, and I discovered Kathy Cohen. And Kathy Cohen is also a political scientist. And as soon as I figured out that these were political scientists doing this work, I changed the arc of my career to leave corporate America and to go back and get my PhD. And that's what I did. I ended up working with Kathy Cohen at U Chicago, and she's now one of my closest friends and advisors. She's family to me, So this journey and this book culminated because I was largely self-taught up until that point. I still to this day have never taken a Black feminism course ever once.
I know you said that in the book, right? But thank goodness for the writers, and thank goodness for the publishers, and thank goodness for you and pursuing this. And I have one other question just right now about the book.
Yeah.
Who did this cover?
Yes,
I bought the book, even though I had the Audible, because I'm like, I love this cover.
So I was very intentional about who I chose to design the cover. I wanted it to be a Black woman. Her name is Zia Gordon. She goes by Careful Black Girl on Instagram, and girl is spelled GRL. She's an incredible illustrator and designer, and she really does beautiful renderings of Black folks' skin and the colors and the richness. And as soon as I saw some drawings she had done of Malcolm X and some of our other four folks, I said, that's the designer. That's the person I want to render. Yeah.
And I'm so grateful to hear that your publisher allowed that.
It has to be, for me, this entire process had to be so intentional. Like everything involved in this process was intentional. Every chapter, for example, was read by two folks that I trusted who were deep in the work, right? This is a peer-reviewed book. There's a deep citation list at the end of the book, right? All
Yes.
of this is meant to convey to folk that the work of Black feminism, the work of archiving and cataloging these Black women's lives, that's serious work. It's serious work, and we have to take it seriously and treat it with the respect it deserves, you know?
Exactly. And we all know that it has been undervalued, and it is actually being undervalued as we speak.
That's right.
I want to give our audience, because one of the things that folks who tune in, they learn from this, and I don't want to take anything for granted. So you're a self-avowed Black feminist. Can you tell me what that means for you and how you define Black feminism?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's interesting. One of those, I really like simple definitions as an educator. And one of the best definitions I've ever heard of feminism generally is that feminism is the belief that women are human, right? That women have a right to be treated with humanity, right? But what the unfortunate part of this is that when people say women, they frequently mean white women, right?
Yes.
So a lot of our Black foremothers and elders have coined the phrase, all the women are white and all the Blacks are men, to indicate that when people think of Black people, they think of men first. When they think of women, they think of white women, right? And so what has happened with mainstream feminism is that it almost always centers the needs of those who are the most privileged, which are white, cis, hetero women. And Black feminism has always kind of stood a bit off to the side, right, from mainstream feminism. But people didn't notice because they were so wrapped up in the waves of feminism. So first wave feminism is the era of Simone de Beauvoir, right? The ones who were concerned about their relationship to men, whether or not their husbands owned them. Meanwhile, they owned Black women, right? They weren't thinking about the women who they actually owned as chattel, right? Second wave is thinking about the wartime when men are out of the home and now women have to think about their own labor and what it means to work outside the home. Meanwhile, they had Black women working inside their homes, or they had Black women already working outside the home and paying them less than they deserved, right? So we move into these waves of feminism, even to the third and fourth wave when they're thinking about reproductive justice. This is an era where they're thinking about reproductive justice, but they are still okay with mass sterilizations of Black and brown women all throughout the country, right? So Black feminism has always stood at these intersections of understanding that although, yes, we are absolutely women, our race creates specific conditions that orient us to power differently from Black men and from white women. So even though we should have solidarity with white women because of our gender similarity and with Black men because of our race similarity, unfortunately, when it comes time to stand up for our politics, they often are not there.
Yeah. I mean, you call out, by the way, Kimberly Crenshaw, who has given us language for that.
Yeah.
Failure to see the intersection and who gets
Right.
lost in that
Right.
gap, right? With the whole idea of intersectionality. And Kim, who is a schoolmate of mine, I continue to be amazed at how important that framework is to help us see what you're talking about.
Absolutely. Intersectionality is so critical. But what I also wanted to do with the book, and this is in the Combahee River Collective chapter, is to give a genealogy of Black feminism and intersectionality, because people seem to think that intersectionality is new, right? Like we just got intersectionality in 1991, when in fact, Black women have been talking about these intersections of identity since 1892, when Anna Julia Cooper wrote A Voice from the South, right? Ida B. Wells wrote Southern Lynch Law and Southern Horrors in 1892. So these were already gendered and race stories that we didn't call it intersectionality, but it absolutely was intersectional in nature. So it was really important for me in this book to also say, hey, listen, we've always been at these intersections. We've always thought of ourselves intersectionally. We just didn't have a word for it, right? That wasn't cited and published in a peer-reviewed journal, and that's a very different thing.
I love how each of the chapters highlights the contributions of specific Black women and, what you learned from them. So just for the listeners, like there's Ida B. Wells, and there's Zora Neale Hurston, and there's Ella Baker, and Fannie Lou Hamer, and Bell Hooks, like some folks who I knew. But truth be told, I didn't know all the stuff that you surface about their life, their struggle, their contribution. So thank you. Although I just watched the Shirley Chisholm documentary. Have you seen this on Netflix?
Yes.
And I'm like, here it is again. And sadly, also looking at the lack of respect and support that Black women get even within their own community, Black community. So that's kind of a theme. That's a little bit of a sad theme as well. But of the women who you highlight, so this might be a difficult question, but of the women who you highlight, which did you identify with most easily? And like, did you have a favorite by any chance?
So here's what I came to, which is that, I actually most identify with Audrey Lord, right? Audrey Lord is actually the only person who I actually have physical words on my body tattoo that she's written, right? Audrey Lord, the reason why I identify so much with her is in part because of her naming intentions, calling herself a radical Black feminist, lesbian, mother, warrior, poet, right? And I embody that very much in the way I choose to name myself as I move into certain rooms and spaces. But also Audrey has always been very open about her experiences as a Black lesbian, as a mother, and her experiences with disability. And in that chapter, I talk about Audrey Lord's experiences as a blind child, growing up blind, and me also being low vision. That was one of the things I never knew that about her, and I learned it later in life. And it really hit home when she discussed being a Caribbean person and how whether she was blind or not, she had to make those grades, and that just hit me so hard, But I hold a lot of disabilities in my body, and they're very much hidden from sight. And the way she writes about disabilities and working through kind of facing mortality in the cancer journals, and how that pushed her to think about self-care differently, it really shifted, my relationship to healing, because so much of her self-care work happened after her diagnosis, right? It happened after she was confronting, breast cancer and her mortality. And it made me realize that we don't have enough time. We don't have time, right? And so we have to do that work now. Also, though, my favorite, I have a ranking of favorite chapters. And my favorite chapter is the Bell. I know it's like picking your favorite child, and I'm like, it's bad, but I can't help it.
I know the bell hooks thing is beautiful.
Right, it's so meaningful to me. There are 3 chapters that are deeply meaningful, and if you read them, you can tell that I wrote them with a certain vulnerability and that I was going through certain things, right? In the Bell Hooks chapter, my grandmother had passed away, and this was a year of loss for me. I lost my grandmother, I lost a dear friend, Lauren Berlant, and that's the same year Bell Hooks passed away. And then reflecting on all of that loss, it made me think about love. And that's where the chapter happened. Because when I originally drafted the book, it ended with Angela Davis. The book ended there. And I in a lot of ways wrote that 11th chapter to hold myself accountable, to say, I don't want to hide from the truth of the matter, which is that I left Bell Hooks out of this book, which makes no sense because Bell Hooks was the second person I read when I found that book in that Borders bookstore, And I was doing an injustice to her by leaving her out of that book. And I wanted to be accountable to myself, to the standard that I hold for myself. I wrote this whole book about loving Black women. And here I am writing a book about Black women, and I don't give a chapter to one of the women who changed my life,
Yeah.
So I had to really reveal that, in that chapter. But Toni Morrison chapter and Zora Neale Hurston are 2 very meaningful chapters to me because they wrote books that changed my writing life. The book that I think I had never read a book like that in my life was Their Eyes Are Watching God. And Beloved, I read it every single year. I open Beloved because I think it's one of the best things that's ever been written.
And I didn't know that Zora Neale Hurston actually had to deal with people who thought that her work was too not high enough. Like the people that she was writing about were not.
They thought she was making a mockery of Black people. They thought she was minstrelsy. They thought it was performative for white people to make people laugh at Black people, which is so problematic, right? When you think about it, because she was writing in African American dialect. That's what she was doing, and brilliantly.
And, well, wait, I have now a million questions. So do you want to share what is on your body that you, what are the words that touch you so much that you wanted to have them readily available?
Yeah. So, well, one you can see here is it wraps around my arm here. Here. And this is from the poem. It comes from the Black Unicorn, when she says, "So it is better to speak, knowing we were never meant to survive." And that quote has always resonated with me, because I think so much, and I say this all the time about how our survival is very much a revolution, right? And how each time we choose to see ourselves in the future, we are absolutely changing the world, right? And then up here it's huge. There you go.
But I just thought it was great to see. Sure. Wow.
So I'm a member of Delta Sigma Theta.
Amazing.
It's humongous.
Yes.
So I'm a member of Delta Sigma Theta, and what it is, it's a elephant. And elephants have always been significant to me. They're majestic creatures, right? They're so important to our ecosystem, and they're loving. They're huge, which has always resonated with me since before. Right, but also the elephant I have wrapped here with African lilies, which it's my favorite flower, but they also symbolize hope. And dreams. And so in that tattoo wrapped through there, it's the quote that says, I rather create myself for myself than be crunched in other people's fantasies for me to eat alive. And this quote is probably one of Lorde's, I guess, most popular ever quotes besides her self-care quote. But folks don't frequently understand that her focus on deciding who she was for herself on her own terms stems from the fact that she was so frequently moving in academic spaces where she was told that her difference diminished or undermined her work. So she was actually declaring, I'd rather be who I am. I'd rather be different than to be a part of this performance of academia, this performance of poetry, this performance of publishing that you all require, because that actually will kill me, right? And so that always resonated with me, that she had no problem saying that very clearly.
I mean, and it's courageous. I mean, once you know, maybe it isn't courageous, but they make it seem like these institutions, it's just the opposite. They make it seem like if you don't get in line with these institutions, you will cease to exist, right? That you will die. And she's saying the opposite. Like, if I try to conform and perform for these institutions according to what they think, then I will die. And it is just a different, and I believe truthful way to see this. And I am grateful for you and finding yourself and speaking who you are, because that's the journey in the book too.
Yeah.
Which is kind of interesting because you're able to highlight all of the foremothers while at the same time taking the reader through your own evolution. And I just appreciated that so much.
I'm glad you did, because there's some people who are like, wait, is this a memoir? Like there's been so many questions of what is the genre? And I've been explaining to people on the road, this book doesn't have a genre, right? So many of our Black
people want to categorize.
They don't like it. You want to stick it in a box. They're like, please put it in a box. And the thing is that, I'm very studied when it comes to Black women's work and writing. And when I think about our Black feminist foremothers and what they did, what they produced, so many of them were academics, yes, but they wrote poetry, they wrote fiction, they wrote narrative, they wrote prose, right? They were creative, and they spent a good deal of their lives thinking about how to take their messages to the world, because I think they were clear about the fact that if we do work that folks can't understand or see themselves reflected in, then there's no point in us doing it, right? If it doesn't make us closer to liberation, or as Toni Bambara said, if it doesn't make the revolution delicious, right, then what are we doing?
I love that.
And I think that's the point of this book, right? The point is that this should be delicious, right? The work that we do should be absolutely enticing. You shouldn't be able to put it down, right? And the way that you do that is you are clear with people that this is not about history lessons and lectures and textbooks, right? This is about understanding that we all have a mutual investment in our collective liberation, right? Writing this book in this way, bringing in my mother and my aunts and my own experiences and my students, right, is to say, look how collective this is, right? Look how common this is. Look how this is affecting everyone, right? It isn't just these 11 folks. right, that I'm
Yes.
talking about. It isn't just an elite group of people of esoteric knowledge, right? This is about all of us. And it brings
Oh, I
folks
like
into the
that.
story.
I like that, Jenn. You know, you mentioned your mom and your aunt in the beginning of the book.
Mhm.
You're in a scene that I could relate to.
Yeah.
You say your mom was pretty much your first Black feminist teacher, and I was wondering,
Yeah.
like, what value or principle or whatever you feel like she instilled in you that sent you
Mm.
in the Black feminist direction. Yeah.
Mm. You know, I would probably say, and I don't know how else to say it, but my mother taught me Sankofa. She taught me
Mm.
to never forget where I come from. I have Sankofas tattooed on both of my wrists. And
Mhm.
actually, this one I share with my best friend, and this one I share with my mother. When I was a kid, I think I was 11 or 12, and I was sitting at the foot of my mother's bed. And I was imagining with her. I used to spend a lot of time just imagining things. She was a single mom, so I was constantly talking her ear off. And I said something that I had a dream about I wanted to do. And she said, "That's fine. Just never forget where you came from." And I said, "What do you
Yeah.
mean?" She's like, she said, "Never forget where you came from." And I said, "I'm never going to forget. I'm never going to forget where I came from." And that was one of the things that my mother always reminded me of as I was leaving for college, as I was getting my first job, as I was going to graduate school, as I was moving further and further away, right? That who my people are and where I'm grounded and who my kin were that brought me here, you know? And I'm so grateful for that lesson because this book is for them, right? I always said, even, as I was in graduate school and I was starting to write my dissertation, I said, I don't want to write anything that my mother and my grandmother can't read, can't pick up and open up and engage with. If the women at church can't read it, then what is the point of me writing it, right? And I think that has always grounded my work because it's important to me that my people are present in my work, that my people have access to my work. I don't care what other people think, right? I've only gone to Black bookstores for this entire book tour, right? And if folks don't see themselves reflected because they're not in this community, I couldn't care less, right? I couldn't
Yeah.
care less because the people who do see themselves reflected are precisely who I'm writing this book for.
And tell me how, and our listeners, how Sankofa and always being connected to your past and Black feminism work together.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I work really hard to draw this through line in the book, right? To show that this is ancestral work, right? Sankofa is the concept of always looking back to where you come from because that's where you're grounded, that's where you're rooted, right? Um, Bell Hooks talks about this as well when she talks about talking with her grandmother and her grandmother saying that part of the issue that Bell Hooks was having was that she was away from home. And so Bell Hooks moved back to Kentucky, right? And that changed things for her. She felt like she was back with her kin. And part of what is important about this for our Black feminist traditions is that everything we do in Black feminism is rooted in community. It's rooted in our chosen families, right? Our other mothers. Right. And this doesn't have to be kin, doesn't have to be folks that we were related to by blood. Right. We have fictive kin as well. The aunts that I start this book off talking about, most of them are not related by blood. Right. But they are my people.
Right.
Right. And they are a home place for me. And Black feminism is also about finding home places because home places are sites of refuge from a white supremacist and an anti-Black state. Home places for people who are not meant to survive are revolutionary acts of freedom, right? It's a form of marinage, it's a form of escape, it's a form of liberation. And so this book is really pushing through all the way to the end, right? All the way to that last chapter on Bell Hooks, thinking about how we can even practice those home places with people who have passed on, right? How we can really tap into all this loss that has happened during COVID-19, all of these tragedies that we have endured, and realize that these people who we love are never going anywhere. They are right here with us. Energy, it doesn't actually dissipate, it doesn't go away, it just transforms, right? And that's what I really want to focus on in the book. These women are right here with us. Their lessons
Right
are right
now.
here
Yes.
right now, right now. And we don't have to be alone, right? We can absolutely, we're doing this with them right here, right now.
It's so interesting. My kid took me to for my birthday. We happened to be in Maryland, and we went to Harriet Tubman's birthplace on the Eastern Shore. And I have to say, like, I, first of all, there was something about being in that place where I started to gain an enormous amount of strength and courage, because I'm like, my ancestors were so badass, right? They created something out of nothing, and I didn't know that she had severe disability, and such that she would have to just stop and rest. And that also spoke to me, Jen, because I was like, sometimes you stop and you have to rest. And you talk about that towards the end of the book as well, about us learning that we take care of so many people. And we also really need to understand that loving is something we need to do for ourselves as well.
That's right.
I don't know if
That's
you
right.
More about that. You were eloquent in the book about it.
You know, that was a tough lesson for me. It was a lesson that I had to learn, I would say, the hard way. I'm a Virgo, and I do too much, you know. But I've always been a person who will go and go and go and love and push and push and push. And it was actually my community that said, hey, listen, you keep talking about loving Black people, but you have to remember that has to include you. And my best friend said this to me. And when she said it, I was like, oh, you know, it hit me really hard, you know, because I was like, whoa, what does loving me look like? I had to actually sit and wonder, well, what does loving me look like? If I actually take time to do it and I'm intentional about it in the ways that I am with loving everyone else, what would that actually mean? And I had to really start taking stock of what it would look like for a life, that if I curated a life where taking care of myself and loving myself was actually a priority and a part of my Black feminist praxis. Right? Where I actually thought about my own health and longevity as a part of my liberation focus, right? That's how we get there too, you know? And that was a challenge for me because we are not socialized to do that, right? We are not socialized at all.
Not at all. In fact, we're made to feel guilty if we aren't there for everyone at every time, no matter what. And of course, you also talk about Black women having this weird existence where you are also asked to help the people who are oppressing you. Like that's often the situation that a number of these women found themselves in. So do you want to say more about that? Because that's just a weird predicament that we have found ourselves in, and we need to actually liberate ourselves from when possible.
Yeah, this is one of the reasons why I had such a bee in my bonnet when it was time to talk about Black girl magic. When they started talking about Black girl magic, and it became a hashtag, I was on the internet and I was like, oh, this is, you know, I was frustrated, and I held it for years because I actually knew the creator of Black girl magic, and I knew she didn't mean what folks meant. They thought, oh, Black women are magical, and now they're going to come save us and put on their capes and put the, you know, the M on their chest for a magical Black girl, and that's going to be it. And I knew that would create new forms of violence against Black women. This idea that Oprah should run for president, Michelle Obama, and every Black woman that they want to cycle through every single year to fix problems that they actively create and are complicit in. Right? So thinking about the ways that this idea about Black girl magic also creates narratives around, you know, superheroes, right? The idea that we're going to put this S on our chest or M for Black girl magic and save everyone from the problems that they have actually created and are complicit in, right? And so when this idea became perpetuated, they started saying things like Oprah Winfrey should run for president, or Michelle Obama, or Stacey Abrams, or Kamala Harris, or whichever Black woman they wanted to slot into that position. And the problem is that it creates this lack of accountability, right? Where we'll create all the problems for you all. We'll be anti-Black and white supremacists, and we'll subscribe to all these systems that actually harm you. But when it comes time to do the work to clean it up, we'll actually ask you to do it, right? And so I wanted to really engage with this because unfortunately, so many Black women feel obligated to step up and fix things, right? I think this comes through also in the Shirley Chisholm documentary. And I try to talk about this in the chapter as well. Shirley Chisholm had a deep belief in democracy. But every time that folks had an opportunity to step up and have her back, they did not. Gloria Steinem didn't have her back. The Congressional Black Caucus didn't have her back. Folks in her own community didn't have her back. Right. And that is absolutely draining. This is why I bring in the concept of weathering. Arlene Geronimous's concept of weathering that says that for some of us, Black women in particular, we may not crack on the outside. People say, oh, Black don't crack. That's because it's not cracking on the outside, but it absolutely is cracking from the inside out, right? So many black women are aging at a disproportionate rate with comparison to their colleagues who are not Black. They are dying of diseases that are largely preventable ailments, things that don't actually make sense. Folks having heart attacks at 21 years old, you know? And that's because of the weight of misogynoir, the weight of white supremacy, the weight of anti-Blackness. So this idea of rest, this idea of not moving from obligation, I lean on Toni Morrison. I've been calling this radical refusal, right? I think a lot about Toni Morrison when she said that Oprah Winfrey called her on her personal phone once, and she replied, "How did you get my phone number?" Right? Because she didn't want to be disrupted, right? And even if it's Oprah, she said, "Don't call me, don't call me," right? And that is that is the kind of refusal we should have, right? That is the kind of boundary setting we must have in a world, in a society that wants to use us all up and pour nothing back in.
So I was going to ask you about what lessons you've unlearned. Since you're talking about which lessons you have, I think that's clearly one, right?
Yes.
That we are not to be there at all times for all people, etc. And we can still love them, but we also must love ourselves so that we can continue. Right? Any other lessons that you feel like you've unlearned or had to unlearn in order to thrive, survive? Yeah.
Well, I love Zora Neale Hurston, and I think that she is highly underrated. She said, if you are silent about your pain, they will kill you and say you enjoyed it. And I originally thought that quote was really about being quiet, right? And I know it's intense, but it's not just. I realized it wasn't just about being quiet, right? It was also about the ways that so much of the narrative making about Black women's experiences, folks look to other folks to define it. That if a Black woman dies, it's almost as if they don't even ask Black women what happened; they ask everyone else.
Wow.
And that other people get to define so much of our life. And it sat with me, that in so many instances that my pain would be up for interpretation, right? My experiences would be up for interpretation, right? And I really appreciate Zora because this was exactly what she experienced, right? This was what happened to her. She went through her life. She passed away of malnutrition.
I know. And she was in that graveyard. Nobody knew where. Yeah.
And we almost lost all of her literature, but for the fact that there was a fire, they tried to set all her work on fire, but for a Black police officer driving by and seeing it and getting all of her work and taking it to the local university, now we have her work. She was really bereft of support and of community. And it was Alice Walker who recovered her, but not only did she recover her body and find her in that grave, she also changed the narrative, right? It was a Black woman who reclaimed her, but she also reclaimed her labor because she said, no, this is important work. This is canon, right? And it was so important that Zora enter the archive at this place of honor and of high regard, because at that point she had entered the archive as a person who died in an unmarked grave of malnutrition, and her community was sitting right there as it was happening. Her family was sitting right there as it was happening. And that, I think, really struck me when I was writing that chapter, that even in death, right? Even in death, they will disrespect you, right?
Yes.
And even in death, they will change the narrative. They will want to narrate your story, but for Black women, but for other Black women. So I took this book really seriously because I also realized that so many of the women I'm writing about are no longer here, right? Many of the aunts are no longer here. My grandmothers are no longer here. And so I said, this is such a critical process I'm engaging in. This is memory work. And I take it very, very seriously. So that it kept reiterating for me that I was doing the same Black feminist work that Alice Walker did when she found Zora Neale Hurston's body,
I mean, it's a gift, Jen. This book is a real gift. And thank you, because you talk a lot about the pains or the ways that people erase and undervalue and misinterpret and mistell, etc., about Black people generally, about history, Black history generally, but especially about Black women, because they are Black and women, two dominating groups, right? Marginalized groups. When I was reading about Ida Wells, girl, I was like, no, first of all, thank you that she was so steadfast in like telling the true story about lynching, despite the fact that she had to deal with people who didn't want her to talk about that because it wasn't. We wanted to talk about a different kind of reality, right, for Black people. We wanted to keep it up. We wanted to make it positive. But the thing that occurred to me is just how courageous she was, but also the peril, because you talk about that. The peril that truth tellers deal with on the regular. And I couldn't help but thinking about, you're telling a lot of truths in this book, in one of the most polarized times that we've known. I mean, it's always been polarized. Let's be real. But people now just feel like they can say anything and do anything. And so, I have to ask you, like, do you ever get scared? Scared for yourself or as a truth teller? And if so, how do you keep pushing forward? You're out here in these streets, as they say, out here in the streets, and you're telling the truth to lots of people. I just wondered how you deal with it all.
So this is an important question, right? Especially since the advent of Twitter and how popular, Black feminist folks have gotten on Twitter and social media and all of that. The violence against, especially Black women online has really increased. I've got tons of death threats over the years for comments and things that are absolutely fact checkable. They've gotten, I would say they've gotten worse, right? In the post-Trump era, during the Trump administration. And there is this idea that folks can say and do whatever they want, right? They threaten you, they threaten your children, and so I absolutely get scared, right? I find that terrifying. I find the idea people want to kill me because I have read books and understand history absurd, right? It is my job.
Doesn't make any sense to me.
It's my job to tell the truth, right? It's my job to teach young people the facts of history. I studied for years to do this. But the Department of Public Safety on my campus still has to open my mail to make sure that no one is sending me anything illicit or dangerous because of the death threats I received 3 years ago. There are still times when they have to check in with me to make sure I don't need a chaperone to help me get around campus. And so these things are deeply concerning. Especially in this time when polarization is so extreme and so clear. I think that what I am heartened by, right, is that I have so much community who's like, listen, we got you, right? And so even though I'm out in the streets at all these talks, every city I come to, I have people who are like, I got you. Do you need me to pick you up? Where are you going to be? Do you need help? I have felt so welcomed and held by community at each of these moments that it helps to offset, right, the concerns about bad actors. Now, I agree with this idea that courage is about being afraid and doing the thing anyway, right? I'm frequently afraid, but I also believe that I've got to do the thing anyway. And so many, as you bring up Ida Wells, so many of our feminist foremothers, that's what they did, right? I can't even think of anyone in this book who didn't have to go do the thing anyway when they were afraid, right? Angela Davis grew up in Birmingham. Right, when it was called Birmingham, okay? So she knew 2 little girls that were blown up in the church that we now refer to in movies and film and music. Like she knew those girls, So I think for me, I can't shy away from the work, right? Because it's already been modeled for me that the stakes are incredibly high, right? The risk is there, but also there's so much reward, right? There's so much reward every time I go to one of these events and a young person, a young queer person, a young trans person is like, I see myself in this book. I feel so empowered now. There's so many things I want to do now. Like that is the point of this work, that's why I teach. That's why I help young people strategize and organize. That's the point of my life. That's my purpose. And so I have to
Yes,
also
yes.
have the hope that I have to have the faith and the hope that I will be protected and that I will be okay and that my community will take care of me.
Well, I feel the same way. It is a faith move on some level, right? But what else are you gonna do? I mean, you know the truth. You got to speak the truth, and other people need to hear the truth because that encourages them as well. I am, in the middle of the DEI backlash, and I am wondering how you think. I mean, what's your assessment of what is happening?
Yeah.
And it is happening to Black women, and they
Mm,
are losing their jobs, and they are dealing with all sorts of hatred and madness. And of course,
yeah.
everything is upside down, and there's this big misinformation campaign. What do you make of it? How are you thinking about it?
You know, I think being a political scientist, I always hold a bit of skepticism and I always am looking at trends, right? This current attack on CRT and DEI is unfortunately par for the course in terms of what we see every few years as the pendulum swings back and forth and back and forth, right? If folks think back to when Barack Obama was running for president, there was this huge focus on folks' nationality, where they were from, if they were immigrants, whether or not, he had a birth certificate. There was the birther movement, right? And that spawned a whole host of new folks who were interested in running for Congress, right? And so we keep seeing these really awful vitriolic ideas that are just rooted in anti-Black racism, that are rooted in the idea that white folks are superior, and that anyone else who gets a job or goes to school or does anything actually does it because of somehow affirmative action or someone did them a favor, right? Meanwhile, Black women are one of the highest educated groups in the country. So it doesn't play out that way. Yeah, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. One of the highest educated groups have the per capita, the most number of actual degrees, So Black women are highly educated, highly educated. So the idea that any of us gets anything as a favor is actually quite laughable, because as we know from this book and from history, Black women have to work so much harder just to get to equity. So it doesn't actually play out that way when you read the data, right? But these folks are not reading. These folks are not doing research, right? They are listening to people who hate Black folk. They are watching awful things on television, and they are fueled by their hatred for Black people. And unfortunately, that's what's been pushing elections ever since we got this awful person, Donald Trump. So I am looking forward to um, I'm looking forward to what happens with this next generation of folks who are really sick and tired of it. The young people who are coming up now. My oldest is 16. His generation is sick of it. My young people who I'm teaching now are sick of it, right? And a lot of them are really turned off by those antics. And I think that while we are in a very dark moment now, I think that that group of young people will absolutely change the landscape of politics very, very soon.
I am so hopeful. And I was also so grateful for your Ella Baker chapter, right?
Yes.
Where you said what did you say? You learned that you learned from Ella Baker. What did you say that young people should be the leaders? Or I'm gonna see what it said. Yeah, Ella taught me why we
Listen to
should
the young
listen
people.
to young
Listen to the young
people.
people. Hmm.
I'm feeling encouraged by the young people too, but tell me what you're seeing in your classroom, what you're hearing,
Yeah. Yeah. I
and
mean,
how
I've
do we
been lucky.
support young people is also
Yeah.
an question I have.
Yeah, I mean, I've been lucky enough to be in the field since 2018. In 2018 to 2022, I was interviewing young people across the country. I interviewed 100 young people in cities all over the country, about 11 cities. And I got to ask them about their lives. I spent time just getting to know young people and asking them directly what they were concerned about, what they were threatened by, what it was like to live in their cities, what they were navigating in their day-to-day lives. And they were completely honest, right? About how they felt about the generational divide in politics. They were very concerned about Trump. They were very concerned about the ways that these attitudes that Trump is creating has created more anxiety and more stress and more concerns at their jobs, at their schools, in their neighborhoods. And people talk about young people, and this is young people 18 to 35, as if they're ambivalent, right? As if they're apolitical and they're not interested. But that's not at all, right? What I've gotten from these conversations, in actuality, they're very targeted, right? So they're using their energy in ways that they think will be effective. So they're completely knowledgeable about local politics. They know exactly what offices to go to get their work done and to get those ordinances changed in their neighborhood and their community. But what they're not going to do is involve themselves with these presidential elections because they don't like any of them, right? And then that is an interesting new development, right? And I think that what we're going to start seeing is that young people are taking these kind of a la carte approaches to politics because they want to focus on the things that affect them directly. What changes my life? What's going to make sure I have access to healthcare? That it's easier for me to get to work every single day. Those are the things that they're most concerned about. And the ways that we help young people, right? And I've been telling folks about this with the book as well, because the hope with this book is that folks will take it into their classrooms. They have a whole syllabus where you can essentially teach this book over the course of a semester. And I want young people to have scaffolding. Our job as elder generations is to create scaffolding, right? Between the hard things, the challenging things, when you're getting from young adolescence into adult life, there are a lot of questions, right? People don't have financial security. They don't understand how to navigate these new questions around pensions and new jobs, right? That's where we come in, that's our job. When people are asking about strategy, how to navigate these administrations at their jobs, how to think about unions, right? We have scaffolding for that. We have resources for that. That's our job, right? They have the energy, but they don't always have the know-how. And so I've always
Yes.
wanted to make sure that I can provide the political education that I have access to, the resources that I have access to, and let them use their energy to change the world.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And the fact that Ella Baker was at odds with some of the civil rights leaders who
Yeah,
uh, didn't want to hear from, from SNCC and didn't want to yeah, it was, I mean, it's important also to see that history kind of repeats itself, right? And
it
so
sure
how
does.
might we avoid this now? Like this was
That's
where we
right.
fell down the last time. Let's actually, and also look at what they were able to accomplish, right? The
Exactly.
young people.
Exactly.
I mean, they were all pretty young, but they were the
They
younger
were.
and then
They were.
established ones. Yeah.
Right, right. I mean, we're talking about college students or people who were in their late 20s and early 30s. So yes, they were all young. But the
Yes.
18, 19, 21-year-olds who are physically mobile, who are not tethered to a mortgage, right? Who can just get up and go. Like that's power. That's how my young people tell me.
Yeah.
They're like, "Oh, Dr. Jackson, you got 3 kids. You can't do this anymore. You can't come." And I'm like, "That's fine. I'll stay home. All right, I'll stay home." Right? But they're not stuck in one city. They can get up and go to a protest that's 4 hours away, right? And these things that's a form of mobility and power that young people have that we don't take seriously enough, right? And they
That's
understand
right.
it, and we've got to get serious about the power that they hold.
I I know I can't keep you here forever, but I do want
Yeah,
there's like three things I still want to hear from you. One
yeah,
is at the beginning of the book, oh my goodness, your words about freedom and then how you take it through the rest of the book.
yeah.
And this idea of freedom from and freedom to, and a
Mhm,
Harriet that I did not know about, Harriet Jacobs. Can you
mhm.
tell us more about your theory about in Black
Yeah,
feminism and freedom and like
yeah.
how you think about freedom?
Yeah, yeah. That chapter comes directly from my course, right? There are some chapters in here that are literally lectures for my young people. And I learned so much from my young people in thinking about freedom. These were conversations I was having at U Chicago when I was still in graduate school. So really, I've always asked them, what is freedom? What is freedom? What is freedom? And sometimes they'll say, I get to go to a music festival and just dance. That's freedom. And then people will say, well, my interior self, like when I'm able to be mentally free, that's freedom. And then we read Harriet Jacobs and they're like, well, wait, I don't know what freedom is, because she didn't even know she was enslaved until she was 6 years old, right? She had been enslaved, but she was living a happy life, right? And by the time she figured out she was enslaved, it was because she ended up going into this condition of essentially being owned by someone actually younger than her, right? Someone who was a family member, and by this awful man who then sexualized her by the time she was in her mid-teens, right? And so part of the reason why her story is so important, because we talk about her interlocking and interaction with freedom and how it changes so much, right? She thought she was free, and then she realized she wasn't. But then she runs to freedom, and the kind of freedom she ends up getting is in this attic. And this attic, I had to explain to my students, is not like a normal attic. She's on her way to freedom, and she's essentially in a slave quarter, and she's still on the plantation she's trying to run away from. And in this slave quarter, she's essentially just between the wall on the outside and the wall on the inside. She can't bend over. She can't stand completely upright. She can only kind of shuffle a little bit and look out of the hole that points outside so she can see her two children playing. And she does this for 7 years. 7 years.
That blew my mind.
7 years. When she goes into that wall, she's 19. When she comes out, she's 26, And so as she is in there, she's in there with vermin and pests, and they're biting her, right? She obviously is not getting enough sun. She's not getting enough nutrients. So she's becoming disabled. Her bones are not healthy. One time she runs out because she thinks someone has found her. She gets in the field. She gets bitten by a snake. So she comes out with a limp, right? And the reason why this attic was so important to think about freedom is because she actually says that's the freest she had ever felt in that attic. And one of my students, she looked at me and she said, Dr. Jackson, now listen, she said, there's no way. There's no way she's in that attic. And I had to explain to her, right, that the thing that made her free was her choice, right?
Her choice.
This was a prison of her own choosing, right? And although she was free from Mr. Flint, Dr. Flint, who owned her, she was not yet free to be fully herself, but she was free from his gaze, from his control, from his constant threat. And that is a form of freedom, right? And they're sitting there in the class. And the thing is, once what I've realized, and I had to explain this to my young people, is that freedom can never be absolute, right? I believe what Angela Davis says, which is that freedom is a constant struggle, right? Freedom is the process. Freedom is the process of getting there, because how do we actually know when we've arrived? Right? We are on a constant journey to freedom, and we find ourselves frequently in these attics. We may be in an attic because of our sexuality, because of our finances, because of our romantic choices, because of the lies that we have not yet faced or the masks that we wear, but we may be in an attic. And in those times when we're in an attic, it's like we're suspended in time, right? We're not progressing, right? We're free from a thing, but we're not quite free to be fully in ourselves and in our body yet, right? So we're in this liminal space, and time stops. And we may be there for 7 years or a decade or a few months, right? While we heal, while we process what our next step must be. And I had to really sit with the lateral movement of freedom. The times as an organizer where we don't have any wins yet, like nothing has happened, but we still aren't in that place where we were, And young people don't like to hear that.
Yeah.
They want wins, but that's not how freedom works.
I know. I hear you. I hear you. Black feminism has given us so much to possess, and such frameworks, I think, that help us escape, get some freedom from the sort of dominant culture, the sort of white supremacist, chauvinistic, like that whole thing. And so, in the work that I have done over the years inside of organizations trying to get people free, I wondered if I believe that people who are in the work of doing DEI could really learn a great deal from this practice and from this way of approaching. And so if you were to talk to like a DEI person who's either starting off or has been there in a while and feels stuck and feels homeless, what would you share with them about Black feminism that could help them be more powerful, more effective?
I think the DEI kind of industrial complex has unfortunately um, it's kind of sullied what it was originally intended to do. I understand why so many folks in the DEI field feel exploited, drained, stuck. And I think that Black feminism often offers us a way in. We start to think about kind of root causes and transformative justice, right? So when we think about transformative justice, the whole idea is like, what is at the base of the problem? What is the actual thing that's happening here? And what does it look like on the surface? And frequently with DEI, the issue is the institution. The institutions have goals, and the folks in the positions are thinking about the people, right? The institutions want certain metrics. The institutions want certain success measures to be met. And the folks who are working have to actually sit there and talk to people every single day and see what they're experiencing. So I think what I would actually say to someone who feels stuck in that position and dealing with that contention is that first we have to get really honest and comfortable with understanding where our personal goals and desires for the world are in disalignment with the institutions with which we find ourselves attached, right? I myself work at a white supremacist anti-Black institution. I work at a private institution, okay, of higher education, right? And so many private institutions of higher education in this country have been complicit in the exploitation of Black people, of poor folks, and of exploiting and excluding people from the universities who have every right to be there, right? And so what I have to do every single day is work to make sure I am not complicit in those behaviors, but also that I am doing work to dismantle, disrupt, and to open up space and hold space so that more folks can come in after me and continue to disrupt and dismantle. That's the only thing that does transformative work. What is the root problem? That there is not space for us, that there is not a place for us, that we are not honored and regarded and respected. And the only way you can do that is by building community, building networks. Most of these DAI agents are in these communities by themselves. It's one person in isolation. And they do that on purpose, right? Because when you're isolated, you really can't be that effective and you sure can't change anything. It's a hostile environment if you have opinions. And so folks have to really think about what resources are at their disposal. This is what Black feminists taught us, especially the Combahee River Collective. What resources do we already have that we already have access to in our own communities, knowledge networks, language? What do we have that can help us to disrupt, dismantle, and open up space and hold that space, no matter where we are? I've done it in corporate America. I've done it in academia. And I think we can do it anywhere.
Towards the end, you say that you taught yourself patience.
Yes.
And I loved just reading that. And I wondered if you could just share a little bit about what that means too, that you've learned more about patience.
Yeah. So one thing that has always been important to me, and I think this also gets to your last question too. One thing that's always been important to me is not shaming people about their Black feminist journeys and not holding shame about my own, right? I was a full adult when I walked into that Borders bookstore. I went to graduate school when I was 30. And by that time, I had not picked up Audrey Lord yet, you know? And there are people who will look at you and say, oh my gosh, you didn't read Audre Lorde until you were 30, or you had never read Octavia Butler, right? And they will pass judgment, right? And they won't offer grace, right? And the problem is these books are not accessible to everyone, right? If my mother had not herself been a child who benefited from the free breakfast program from the Black Panthers, she may not have known very much about Angela Davis to tell me about her when I was 15, right? That was a beautiful gift to me that so many people don't have, right? And so the patience at the end of the book that I want to convey is to say, your Black feminist journey is yours. It's your own, right? It doesn't have to look like mine. It doesn't have a time attached to it. There is no sense of urgency here, right? You can discover these texts, you can discover these women's lives, you can encounter this work and continue to encounter this work on your own terms, and be patient with yourself and offer yourself grace. You're going to read some things you won't understand. Hortense Spillers is hard to read. Sylvia Winter is hard to read, right? Give yourself time, give yourself a chance, right? And I wanted to say that at the end of the book, in part because I intend for this book to be a beginning and not an ending, right? I intend for this to be the book that people walk into the store and they pick up, just like I did Melissa Harris Perry's Sister Citizen, and they continue along their journey. They're going to keep going, and I want them to feel confident that their journey matters and it's valuable.
And thank you for the list of authors that you add to the end of the book. So after people pick up your book, everybody pick up the book, where do they go next? Where would you suggest they go next?
Yes. So you can learn all about the book tour if you're interested in seeing me in person, by going to my website, jennmjackson.com/books. You can also find out real time updates from me on Instagram at Jenn M Jackson PhD, or across all social media at Jenn M Jackson PhD. The book tour is still going on, and I have stops all the way through summer. So we'll be busy.
Wow. I hope
Yeah.
I get to come see you in person. I really do. I mean, thank you for the book. Thank you for spending time with us on Sundays with Vernā. We haven't even covered so many of the things that you write about in the book
Yeah.
and so many of the incredible women. But that means that people need to buy the book and read the
Yes.
book and follow you. And I am just so grateful for you. It is my joy to have a chance to talk with you and to learn so much from you. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. This was so fun. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us. Be sure to follow me at Vernā Myers on Instagram and Twitter. You can also listen to my podcast on Spotify and Apple Music. Subscribe to my channel and share this episode with someone who is going to join us in this space. Make sure to visit my website for DEI resources and online learning courses at vernamyers.com, and make sure you sign up for my newsletter to stay in touch with me. Thank you again for listening, and see you next time for more Sundays with Vernā.